So, opinions are important. And the example I've got from my life is not my own opinions on other things, but people's opinions of me. You see, I've been writing books for many, many years, way back to the 1970s. And in all that time, no publisher has ever actually offered me money and offered to publish one of my books. And if you heard that story, you'd probably think, well, I wonder why. Why hasn't Mike ever been published? I know, it must be because his books are no good. And that, you think, is probably the publisher's opinion, and that's the reason they decided not to publish them. But let me tell you a little bit of history, of what actually happened. Way back in the 1970s, I finished my first novel. I tried writing novels before then, but I'd done bits and pieces and never actually got to the end. So the first novel I ever wrote, this was in the days before computers, so I wrote it all out on a home typewriter, and then I had to get some friends to help me type it up neatly, and then I got a little package together. I wrote a synopsis of the story, and I got the first chapter and I got it photocopied because I couldn't print it out, no such thing, and I put that in envelopes and I sent it off to publishers to get their opinions, see what they thought. And over the course of maybe a year or so, I sent that synopsis and first chapter to 66 different publishers. Most of them sent them back. 9 publishers asked to see the whole novel. So I got all the bits of paper and I put them in a ring binder and I wrapped them up in cardboard and I posted them off. And out of those 9, 8 of them just sent it back. And they sent it back with a rejection slip. And that was a neatly typed piece of paper which said, thank you very much, but we've decided not to go ahead with this book. Okay? So that's difficult, isn't it? Because they didn't actually say they didn't like it. They didn't actually say there was anything wrong with it. They just said they weren't going to publish it. So I might have thought to myself, well, maybe it's not any good. But actually, I don't know that because they didn't tell me. I didn't know what their opinions were. But what about number 9? Number 9 was a publishing company called Panther, and they published mass market paperbacks back in those days. They're not around anymore. And they said, yes, they're very interested in publishing this book, and they were going to have a few meetings about it. And they had a meeting, and then they wrote me a letter, and they said, you know, the problem with this book is it's about folk singing. Well, it was, because I'd been to a class and I tried to find out about how to write books, and they told me, write about what you know. And I'd been going to folk clubs since the age of 16, so I knew about folk clubs, and I wrote a book about folk singing. And they wrote me a letter saying they were thinking about it and they weren't too sure. And then after a while they wrote back and they said no, they couldn't go ahead with it because they thought folk singing wasn't that popular, wasn't that interesting. There weren't that many people around who liked folk singing and would be interested in reading a book about it. Now, don't forget that some people told J.K. Rowling that writing a book about a teenage wizard wouldn't be popular, and they weren't correct about that. However, folk singing has never been that popular. I had to agree with their opinion, and therefore I had to accept the fact that they weren't going to publish it. However, they turned down the idea of publishing. But in all that correspondence, they never once said that the book wasn't any good. They didn't say anything about the characters, or the plot, or the dialogue, or the tone, or the story development. So you might come to the conclusion that because the book wasn't published, that was because it wasn't any good. It wasn't very well written. It was badly put together. And yet, during all that time, nobody said anything about that. So your opinion that that book didn't get published because it just wasn't a good enough book, that wouldn't be true, would it? Those weren't the facts. That would be your judgment. That would be maybe even your opinion. But as far as I know, nobody ever said that about that particular book. So let's fast forward to the 1980s. And by that time, after a few more attempts, I decided that I was going to concentrate on science fiction. Because ever since I was a teenager, I've been reading science fiction. I've been going to the library and getting lots and lots of science fiction books out and read them avidly all through my teenage years. So I thought I'd have a go at writing a science fiction novel. And I put together a couple of chapters and a synopsis of an idea. I sent it off to a science fiction publisher and they wrote back and said, that's very interesting, we'd like to read the book. So I had to write the book, and after a few months of that, I actually handed it over at a science fiction convention to this man from Gollancz, the science fiction publishers. And he thought about it for a couple of months, and then he came back and said, no, he didn't really like it because he didn't find it convincing. It was set in the future, and it was all about people living on the asteroids, the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. And he said he didn't find it believable. There wasn't enough detail about what it was like, how it felt to be living in these tunnels, in these rocks flying through the sky. And so he didn't really want to publish it. Okay. So you might think that he didn't like the book, and he thought it was badly written, and he didn't like the character development, or he didn't like the dialogue, or on the contrary, all he was saying was that he found it a bit unbelievable. He didn't say it was a bad book, and in fact he was quite willing to act as agent. He sent that book out to other publishers, and he was hoping that one of them might decide that he wanted to publish it, in which case he'd be getting 10% as the person who'd introduced me to that person. Now, unfortunately, that didn't work out. But you see the problem. That book never got published. But as far as I know, nobody ever said it wasn't actually well written or there was something wrong with it. I mean, this business about it being unbelievable, I wrote to him and said, okay, well, I could change that. I could work on it. I could develop those aspects. And he said, no, that was just his personal opinion, and it wasn't worth me as an author worrying about it. He didn't like it, but he was sure lots of other people would, and he was quite happy with it. So his judgment was that he didn't want to publish it, but his opinion was that he quite enjoyed reading it. There was just this slight niggle, something missing, and he thought that it wouldn't do him any good if he was the publisher. So I, as the author, got turned down. But it's hard to believe that the book was bad, that it was just not worthy of publication, because he believed that it could have been published, just not by him. So let's move on to the 1990s. Now by then, I'd stopped doing science fiction and I started writing crime fiction, something I was very interested in, again from my teenage years. And I'd read Raymond Chandler, and I'd read Dashiell Hammett, and I even read a bit of Mickey Spillane and Ross MacDonald, all those people. And I thought maybe I could do something like that. I could write crime stories based around the area I lived. I lived in Manchester at the time. And maybe not a private eye, but some kind of hero that was very similar. And I started putting together ideas and writing a first couple of chapters and a synopsis and sending them off to publishers and sending them off to different publishers and doing it on a regular basis all through the 1990s. And here's the strange thing. I started getting opinions. Many more opinions than I'd ever had before. But I was sending off more submissions and I was getting more returns. So maybe that was part of the reasons. But I started getting criticism. People were saying they didn't like the character. People were saying they didn't like the setting. People were saying they didn't like the plot development. They didn't like it. They didn't like it. That's what they said to me. And instead of having just some standard rejection slips that were typed out saying, no, sorry, this is not for us, I started getting rejection slips with little writing on it. And some of it wasn't so bad. Some of it was saying, not this time, but try again soon. That kind of thing, encouraging you to say, we don't like that idea, but maybe you could give us another idea. But some of it was really critical. Some of it was saying, no, this is rubbish, this is terrible. People were actually saying, I don't like the character, I don't think it's believable, and so on. But then something started to occur to me, and that is that if I looked at their opinions were often totally contradictory. So somebody was saying that the story was too action based. There was too much action and not enough character development. Okay, that was a criticism. But then I'd get another criticism that said there was too much time, people sitting around talking, there wasn't enough going on. So that was a criticism, but it's the complete opposite. One person's opinion was that this was good and that was bad, and the other one was saying, no, that bit was good, the other bit was bad. The bit that this person said was good, this person said was bad. This person said that was bad, this person said it was good. I was very confused. And then I got a letter that really got me thinking. It was a long handwritten page of stuff. Well, I thought, that's constructive, that's very helpful. Somebody's trying to help me along the road. But it was signed by a lady, and she had 3 names, and I don't remember the name, but maybe it's something like Bernadette Exbury Exxon, and it said editorial assistant. So that told me a couple of things. One was she was very posh, obviously, and she was an editorial assistant, which is kind of the lowest of the low. It's the person who makes the coffee and kind of learns the business of publishing as they go. And also she was trying to be very helpful, which was a sign of a beginner, I thought, by that time. But what she actually said was, she said, this is not up to our usual standard, but we're interested in what you're writing about, so please send us your next idea for a novel. So that's very positive, thank you very much. And then she said, just trying to be helpful, she said, and don't worry, she said, I've talked to several colleagues and they've all said that authors mostly don't get their first book published. It might take maybe 5 or 6 novels before they finally write something that's worth publishing. Now that's a very interesting comment, because you see, that shows that maybe she thought what I'd sent her was my first novel, but it wasn't. She'd said I'd have to write maybe 5 or 6 novels before I got published. I actually had written 5 or 6 novels by that time. And she also seemed to be saying that once I'd written 5 or 6 novels, my writing would be better, it would be improved in some way, and therefore I would be ready for publication. But I had written 5 or 6 novels. And don't forget, in the 1970s, somebody had actually been willing to think about publishing one of my novels. So that meant that I'd written 5 or 6 novels over a number of years. Obviously, my writing was not improving with age, but was getting worse. If I was nearly published in the 1970s, but definitely not published in the 1990s, then presumably that meant, from these comments that I've read, that my writing was just not good enough. The character development was wrong, the dialogue wasn't right. That was the sort of thing people said. Although there might be another explanation, and that is that these people in the 1990s looked at what I wrote and decided not to publish it, and people had done that in the 1970s, but decided that having made that judgment, they needed to kind of explain themselves. They needed to justify. Just like if I said to you, what do you think of my new book? And you said, I don't really like it. And I said, why not? Why didn't you like it? What was wrong with it? And you desperately hunted around and tried to think of something. And therefore these comments that I was getting, these so-called opinions that I was getting in the 1990s, were people's desperate attempts to justify the fact that they didn't like the books, and therefore they had to say something about the dialogue or the character or the plot, because that was the kind of things the critics said. And actually what was going on wasn't that my writing was deteriorating and people were spotting that and giving their opinions about that. It was the fact that in the 1990s people felt that they had to give opinions, whereas in the 1970s they didn't. And therefore they were saying the kind of things that might sound logical, but actually had absolutely no basis in fact, in reality. They decided not to publish my books, which is fine, because they're publishers. They might like my book, they might not like the book. They might decide to publish it, they might not decide to publish it. But the fact that they come up with all these opinions didn't mean necessarily that the opinions were justified or even true. So let's move on to this century. I'm still writing crime fiction and I'm still not getting published by established traditional publishers. But then I discover internet publishers and I find a way of actually getting my books printed. And what that meant was, instead of a pile of paper sitting on my desk at home, or instead of some file in a computer, I suddenly got a book. And this is one of my books. And I suddenly found that I could read what I'd written and I could give it to my friends and family. And that's when I invented the idea of the 7 levels of publishing. Because the first level is the author gets themselves a book. Finally, I see my writing in print. And I think there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people out there who have written a book and all they really want is to see it in print so they can read it and say, yes, I'm an author, aren't I? And they can show it to their friends. Their friends say, oh, you've written a book, I'd like to read that. And they can say, sure, here's the book, okay? If you don't do this, then it means that all you've got is a pile of paper or a computer file. Are you going to lend that to your friend? No. So I got myself a book, I printed out a few copies, I handed them out to people. And here's an interesting thing. Nobody ever picked up this book, started to read it and said, my goodness, how did this book ever get published? It's rubbish. Nobody ever said that. People liked it, some of them didn't like it. But nobody said, oh, the characters are unbelievable and therefore it's not worthy of publication. And even more than that, what I've done with several of my books is I've put them on as e-books on the internet. And some of those books have sold thousands of copies. And nobody has written back saying, this book doesn't deserve to be an e-book. It's a complete waste of money. Nobody's ever said that. People have paid the money, read the book, some of them have liked it, some of them haven't liked it. But nobody has ever said that I'm such a terrible writer that they can't believe that my books would ever see the light of day. So that's a very strange thing, isn't it? And when you look at this book, this is called Hartness Running, and it's one of the first stories about Amelia Heartless. Amelia to her friends, or Heartless as she is known. And this book has been turned down by dozens of publishers. The people who've read it haven't spotted that. Nobody said, oh, that book, yes, I read it, but I could tell that it wasn't good enough for publication. It's even been reviewed. Some people like it, some people don't like it, but nobody's ever said, you're a hopeless writer, you should give up the idea. People have said constructive things like, well, I like that character, but I didn't like the way they interacted. Positive recommendations, and I've borne that in mind when writing another book. And here's something really strange. This is a book called The Folk Singer 2013. So, you might think that what I did was take the book from the 1970s and prepare it for publication on the internet. No, I didn't do that. I took the idea of the book in the 1970s and wrote a crime novel based on the idea that some people had read that book and were acting out some of the things that they read about as happened into it. So it's a bit more complicated than that. But this is a book that was written in 2013 as part of National Novel Writing Month in November of that year. And the character you see on the front, he is a folk singer, do you recognise him? Is Phil Ochs. He was a contemporary of Bob Dylan in the 1960s. Later on, he committed suicide. Very sad. But he's a folk singer. This is a crime novel, but it's about folk singing. And nobody who's read that has said, no, the thing I didn't like about it was that it was about folk singing. Because as you know, not many people are involved in folk singing or even interested in folk singing. Strange thing is, nobody's ever said that. They've read it as a crime novel. It involves folk singers, it involves folk clubs, it involves folk songs, and they've been happy to read it. Now, what does that tell you about the difference between what readers think and what publishers think? Publishers are interested in something that a lot of people are going to be willing to read. So maybe crime fiction isn't the most popular genre, and maybe folk singing isn't the most popular subject, but the number of people who have read the book have been quite happy. Nobody said it was a complete waste of time, and I think that proves that people's opinions, you know, this idea that's been passed to me that maybe my writing is not up to standard, has followed from their judgments. The publishers who decided not to publish the book about folk singing, maybe they were right. Maybe there weren't enough people who were interested in folk singing who'd have bought that book to have made enough money for the publishers to think it was worth their while. Maybe that's true. But that doesn't mean it was a bad book. That doesn't mean it couldn't have been published. Because here's the thing. A book about folk singing has been published, has got a small readership, has made a small amount of money, and most people who've read it have been quite happy about this. So what was their opinions? What was their judgment? Was it any worse than the opinions and the judgment people made all those years ago? I think that when people say, no, that's my opinion, actually it's a bit less complicated than that. It's about the fact that people make a judgment and then they have their opinions, not the other way around. People didn't read that book and say, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like that, but I like that, I like that, and that. And I add up all these things, and logically that means the negatives outweigh the positives. That's what we'd like to believe. We'd like to believe we're logical, but actually opinions, in my opinion, come second to making your mind up. You like it, you don't like it, and that's fine. That is your right. You can have that judgment. But then, anything you say after that, you say, I like it. What I'd like to say is this: stop. You like it? Fine, stop. Don't tell me why. Not interested. You say you don't like it? Stop. Don't tell me why. Because what's happened is, you like it or you don't like it. And then what you're going to do is your brain is going to start working to come up with the opinions that you're going to pretend justify the judgment, whereas in fact the judgment came first, not the opinion.